Beginning of this starts, well, is that back pile. Just like you did coming off of double T when you've worked on that back pile, well, here it is again. You establish that pile across. First couple of days, we start pretty easy, just kind of get them rolling, and then we'll do a little force into the water. Now, I don't force very heavily here because we've done plenty of that. We've done pile work. We've done fetch to the pile. We've done mini T. We've forced on the double T, and we've probably had a few sessions, but I'm going to force at least once before they get in the water and once while they're in the water. I do that a couple days in. I want them to understand the first step, and I'm going to talk about the goals of swim by. And the first one is going to be a commitment to get in the water, and that reinforcing to get in the water and reinforcing to continue while they're in the water is the first part after you've established that back pile. There's your overs. And again, in a perfect world, your pond is about 3 times as long as it is wide. And in this instance, there's where my over, it's essentially a T in the water. Now, the swim by part really doesn't come until the end of the swim by drill. The initial part is establishing that back pile, then teaching them to stop, and then a T in the water where they stop and cast to an over pile. And remember, I talked about it in depth in the videos where when you stop in the middle and you cast, you may throw a bumper out there and then you run over and receive them at the other end. In this instance, I usually did the right over and went over and received them at the left over and taught them to swim down the channel. Now, oftentimes when I move, the temptation to cheat and run around on that return is a lot stronger because it's narrower. And these dogs haven't really been de-cheated all that much. Now, you've emphasized getting back in the water from the back pile. But when you go to those overs, well, the temptation to run around is pretty strong. And if you saw in the video with Coop, he started to run around. I stopped him with a whistle because we've taught him that on double T, remember? And then I moved kind of opposite. So he started to come back to the original line, and I moved further away from him towards the back pile and blew, and maybe even I nicked, and then I did a strong here to get him in the water. And once he got in, then I guided him down to the exit point. And that's how we started, establishing A, the stop, B, the over, and C, the exit point, which is going to be the exit point for the swim by process. There's your T, the whole deal there. That's what it looks like on this pond. Let's talk about the goals and the purpose of swim by. Why do we do swim by? Because swim by all in itself, you're never going to be real tested on swimming by at a hunt test or a field trial. However, the lessons learned to put them through swim by drive home the rules around the water. Purpose of swim by, goal number 1, is a commitment to enter the water, to get in the water. Talked about that on the back pile. The first part of every water blind and every committed water retrieve is a willingness to enter the water. This is where we drive home the rules of getting in the water when you're told. These aren't dogs that hate the water. I'm not in that situation, but virtually any dog untrained is going to choose to run around the water on a retrieve if they weren't trained to do otherwise. And this is the beginning of the commitment to enter the water, the commitment to get back in the water. Now, in the instance of the back pile, it's the return. But entering the water and then re-entering the water, whether it's en route to a retrieve or on the return, it's essentially the same thing. You've made a swim, you got out of the water, and the temptation to not get back in the water is stronger. So the re-entry on a retrieve, whether it's en route to the retrieve or on the return, well, the commitment to get back in the water. That's goal number 2. Well, then we look for the solid water tread. And our last, the commitment to stay in the water. Get in the water, get back in the water, learn to tread water, and then a commitment to stay in the water. That really is the vast majority. If you just took 3 of those 4, the commitment to get in, the commitment to get back in, the commitment to stay in, well, isn't that the majority of what goes on? If that theme and message is clear when you come out of swim by and they understand direct pressure to do any of those things, in other words, they understand back on a neck to get in the water. They understand maybe a here on a neck to re-enter the water, or in the swim by process, it's the same thing to some degree. And then the swim by where they have to swim up the channel, well, that's the commitment to stay in the water. So when they understand and they have had those lessons coming out of swim by, well, you've given yourself the tools to move forward. They understand pressure in and around the water, what it means. And in the context of these 4 things, if they come out of there with a clear understanding of what they're supposed to do and an understanding of how to respond when they've been corrected to do any of these things, well, then you've done your job. It's what it should look like. And you're ready to go. Once you start that water tread and then you cast to the one over. My next move is to go down and receive them at the other end. Show them and identify the exit point. Teach them to seek the center of the channel on that return. And then I start coaxing. In other words, I move partway down the channel. I don't move all the way to the exit point. I may have stopped them, given them a right over. I move partway down the channel, and when they pick up the bumper, at this point, I'll typically blow a whistle and cast them into the water and then guide them down there and start to get the idea that I'm casting on return. Because again, you've done a little bit of discipline casting on the land, on finishing up double T. So the idea of casting with a bumper in your mouth is not totally new. And you're trying to guide them down the center of the channel. You're going to gradually start to dive into the real swim by where you don't move down to the end. Once they get the idea of swimming by and they're starting to grasp it, I don't blow a whistle if they turn and come towards me. I just throw my arm out. I say over. Some people say no, but it's a 90-degree cast in the direction they need to swim by. And just as they turn towards me, over. And then I'll do over with a nick on the R. Again, that's really the sweet spot there in swim by. When they understand it, but they're not quite doing it yet consistently. They're not quite convinced. And they may swim a third of the way down the channel and then turn to come towards you. And you go over with a nick and they accelerate into the swim by. And then, in the learning process, then I might meet them down there a few times because I want to mold the response to number 4, commitment to stay in the water at this point. Some dogs will start to dig to the back pile. Well, then I'll blow a trill or come in, beep, 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 beep. And just as they turn, I throw my arm out. And if they insist on going to the back pile, that come in whistle may have a nick with it. But I'm going to kind of guide them down that channel. And I'm not going to stop them and then blow a come in. I'm going to blow beep, 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 because I really don't want to stop the momentum of the return. I just want to mold it down to the end. It's not beep, over, beep, back. The whistle is only used when the ship is sinking, when you can't get them to go back. And sometimes it's your last resort. It's in the beginning when I'm just teaching it, I'll use it to get them to look at me and start the idea, but I'll quickly accelerate to just the cast. And ideally, it becomes just a crisp, silent cast. You throw your arm out in that direction when they look at you, and boom, they turn and focus down to the end of the channel. When they really got it, you see them start to really create a wake. They churn down that way. It's a pretty satisfying deal, boy, and they've got that idea. Now, they understand it in the context of that pond. So don't think it's just going to carry over without, proofing it. Let's talk about proofing it. You finish swim by. This is where I proof swim by. And I'll go down and I'll just hand throw a mark over the corner. And now it's really their first cheating signal, really. It's a cut the corner. And if they go to cheat, I'll stop them on a whistle and cast them in. I'll do a swim by to the left. In this instance, if they swam that whole channel, they'd swim 100 yards or more. But I'll just get them to commit down the channel. Once it looks like they'd be willing to swim, I'll usually release them. Let me show you a couple versions of that. So the first one is I stand pretty close. I hand throw the mark. I send them for it, and then I'll work on the swim by. And sometimes I've got to reteach it here, that I'll have to go through some of the ladder steps that I did on the swim by pond to transfer it to a different location. And if I sense a lot of confusion, well, then I'm going to nurse them through it a little bit. I am going to probably make some corrections when it feels right, but I don't want to have a battle here. Ideally, you may make a correction or two. Then they get the idea. Pretty exciting when you start to see that. So again, there's your first essentially line to that hand-thrown bumper. And then there's your swim by cast down the channel. Just find a corner, a channel somewhere. Try to find it where, again, you have some sort of parallel shores. If I didn't have a swim by pond and I had an end of a pond like this, any of these little corners could have been swim by ponds. That one on the far left could work. You've got an open end there, but this is the kind of things you look for. But it's a great place to look for to do the proofing. So the final proofing cast is when I move over and throw the bumper by the water. So the dog doesn't get wet on the retrieve, but then has to cast into the water in return. That's really typically the hardest. But that's what happens in the real world. You've done it long mark, and a dog goes to run around. At the beginning of that arrow, right at the S, is oftentimes where the correction happens, and then the cast into the water. So when I can throw that bumper out and cast them into that channel from 10, 15 feet out of the water, and they'll commit to a swim by, well, I feel pretty good about my proofing. And that's kind of how that goes.